morning, good afternoon, good evening, based on time zone you're watching this video. My name is Victor Monga. I am a board member for Cloud Security Alliance LA chapter. With me today, I have Anil Dadani.
My name is Anil Dadani. I'm the education director for Cloud Security Alliance LA chapter.
Great. And we do have our special guest slash consultant slash advisor slash great person, Michael Wiley.
Oh, me.
Yeah, you.
Your introduction doesn't sound like me there, but thank you. Yeah, Mike Wiley, Director of Cybersecurity Services, Ritchie May Technology Solutions. Got my handful and all things security related. So happy to be on the panel here. And if there's any questions, I'll be on mute in the meantime.
Thanks, Michael. All right, on the screen, you'll see a QR code that you can scan. It'll take you to our LinkedIn, Twitter, and YouTube. All of these sessions are recorded, so you can find the recording later on our YouTube channel. If you have any questions about the CCSK study group, you can send it to learn@csala.org. Today, we're going to talk about week 6, module 6. Again, this is a part of a study group we've been doing from last 5 weeks. Today is our 6th week. Anita and I are moderating these sessions, so I'll just fast forward to that. Today, again, Mr. Joshua Ma has been helping us. He is going to review module 6 with all of us. Joshua, would you like to introduce yourself?
Hey everyone, Josh here, and I've been a member of CSA LA for about 6 months. I am a I do risk management for cybersecurity for SoCal Edison, and really have been enjoying these modules, and just kind of happy to continue studying and ready to get this thing going.
About CCSK exam, once you've gone through all the modules, all the trainings, you're ready for the exam. It's going to be 14 domains, 6 modules, and 1 exam. The exam is about 90 minutes. You'll be presented with 60 questions, and you would have to score 80% in order to pass the exam. As I said, it's a 6 weeks, 6 modules study group. Today, we are reviewing our last 6th module. After that, we really expect everyone to go in and take CCSK certificate. We started module 1, commitment of hour and hour and a half. We reviewed resource pools. We reviewed service models, deployment models. We talked about shared responsibility. All of those recordings and slides are available. If you scan this QR code on the screen, it'll take you to our LinkedIn page where you can find the slides, and it also has URL for YouTube recording. And here we're just showing that we have YouTube recording and the slides available. There's a short link if you would like to use that. Module 2, week 2, we reviewed all the infrastructure as service security. That module should have taken you about 2 hours to 2.5 hours. We talked about SDN, software-defined networking. We covered management plane, storage plane, control plane. We also talked about packet capture challenges that has presented when you move your network and servers or compute to cloud. Same for week 2, we have video recording. We also have slides available. Module 3, it should have taken you about 2 hours to 2.5 hours. We talked about governance. We talked in length about what the difference between enterprise governance, InfoSec, IT compliance, legal considerations, and the CSA tools. All of these tools are free to consume. So you can go to Google and just type a CSA, CCM, Cake, Starwatch. We discussed all of these things in length, and if you'd like to get a hold of that recording, please scan that QR code on your screen. These slides are available, and the recording is available. Module 4 was a little bit shorter. It was 1.5 hours to 2 hours. We talked about cloud data storage. We talked about securing data in the cloud, and I think, Josh, you covered this module, right?
That's correct.
Awesome. So anybody has any questions for that module, please bring it up to Josh today. We talked about encryption. We talked about the KMS, key management system. We talked about having KMS on-prem versus cloud, or having a third party managing your keys. We talked about different components of key management, key engine, actual keys. We talked about data security lifecycle during this module. Once again, we have slides and YouTube recording available for you guys to go review and watch it. In the previous week, we reviewed module 5. It should have taken you actually 2.5 hours to 3 hours. It was a bit lengthy. and we went over time. Babu covered it in pretty length. Thank you for that. But SDLC, we talked about testing and assessment. We talked about DevOps and immutable. We talked about IAM definition, standards, and practice. Again, it was a lengthy module. Once again, if you would like to get a hold of recording or the slides, the QR code should have taken you there, or you can use this short link. Once again, every week we remind shared responsibility model. And that's something, it has been discussed multiple times. And why are we still repeating it? Because it's not adopted yet. But at the end of the day, know your responsibility, know where the boundaries are, make sure you understand your cloud provider responsibility and your as a consumer/customer responsibilities.
Yeah, thank you, Victor. And thanks everyone for showing up for this last week of the study group. Again, my name is Josh Ma, and I'm excited to get into this and happy to have you guys ask any questions along the way or interject with any examples that you know of or from your professional experience. Definitely please chime in whenever you need to or feel like it. So today's module is module 6, the last module of this course. And the time commitment should have taken about 1.5 to 2 hours, not too long. Well, those modules listed on the right, those topics, really involve talking about how to select the correct cloud provider, what characteristics to look for. It also touches on incident response. And then it gets into the category of security as a service, which is really a cloud-centric security product that we can apply in our environments and look into those. We'll talk about the categories that security as a service covers, some recommendations when you're evaluating them. And then we'll also talk about some other related technologies that are cloud native, but didn't really fit into any of the other modules. And then finally, the last part is actually going to be covered by Victor as he talks about some exam prep tips for the CCSK. All right. So selecting a cloud provider, characteristics to look for. Bear with me, there's a lot of writing in a lot of these slides because characteristics are things that we want to spell out. Compartmentalization of job roles, well-defined security policies, reviewable audits. As you can see, that list goes down. These are all characteristics that we want to be mindful of when we think about what we're looking for in a cloud provider. And we want to sort of review them against the backdrop of our own organization's governance, policy, standards, to understand what risk we can take whenever we're moving to the cloud, right? So we definitely want to look at, say, the fifth one, well-defined contractual language, because so much of what is going to be spelled out in terms of what security we get is really dependent on the contract and the SLAs that we get when we work with these cloud providers. So that's particularly more important now that we sort of outsourced our data or sourced our data out into the cloud. I also want to understand configuration patch management process that cloud providers follow. We also want to look at the security that how they integrate security within their development and their operations. And finally, we also want to make sure that they're prioritizing security in the way that we would for our own information, our own operations, our own services. The module also talks about documentation to look for when you're selecting a cloud provider. And it kind of gives this triangle, this triad of 3 things that we definitely want to look at. The first one being the scope and the time. We kind of want to look at the scope and the time of the documentation. Scope being, hey, what exactly is covered by the cloud provider? Victor talked about the shared responsibility model. And of course, that is probably the biggest takeaway you need to have when you study security in the cloud. What scope is covered by them? What do we need to cover? What controls do we need to put in place for anything that's not mitigated by the provider or is not handled by them? We also want to look at the time. So review the documentation to make sure that we understand what time is covered, the SLAs, to see if they're responding within the time that we would require of ourselves, that we would expect of ourselves. Service coverage sort of falls in line a little bit with scope. And then audit firm history is sort of looking at the documentation of the cloud provider and what if they've been audited by a third party to understand where they fall in terms of their well, to see how well they've done in the past based on audits by third parties. Critical security capabilities, there are a lot here, and there'll probably be more when you look at the CSA guidance. That's part of the CCSK package that's available on their website. But we kind of want to look at their API access and admin monitoring. Remember, now that everything's in the cloud, it's really important to be able to understand the metastructure, who has access to that, make sure that it's monitored, logged, it's controlled, right? Because there's so much more importance now weighted in that. Elasticity and auto scaling, making sure that a cloud provider can scale up to meet our demands, and then also scale down, right? And it's actually, I believe that auto scaling, that ability to scale up and down, is an essential characteristic of a cloud provider. So it's important that we definitely take a look at that. There are plenty of others. We'll talk about like identity and access management entitlements, which we've covered in previous modules. Making sure that they support the security assertion markup language, SAML. Having multiple accounts per customer to limit blast radius. We also want to make sure that they're using software-defined networking, right? It's really powerful, as we've learned. I think it was in maybe module 2 or 3. It's a very powerful way that cloud providers isolate. It's a very powerful tool for cloud providers to isolate the technology and make sure that they can have and enable multi-tenancy in a way that secures every single tenant within themselves. Region and location control are also important. And then of course, infrastructure templating, automation. We've talked about infrastructure as code and how that can be a very valuable security tool to implement your cloud environment.
Any questions so far? Sorry to interrupt you. Any questions so far about what Josh has covered? Okay, no questions. Josh, you're doing a good job. Thank you.
Oops, sorry, let me go back. So I know there was a lot of bullet points and a lot of writing, and I wanted to put these 4 up here. Number 1, because it was in the module, but also number 2, because I wouldn't have been able to remember all of that. I definitely can't simply remember all of that off the top of my head. But the great thing is that we don't, right? These CSA tools are here because they present us with everything that we need to kind of cover all of those security capabilities that we talked about. So the cloud control matrix, the CCM, it lets us look at a huge matrix of controls that we can implement to secure our cloud environment. The cake, the questionnaire that vendors should be answering, lets us get a really good snapshot of what their security posture is in the cloud. And then you have like the STAR and STAR Watch, the registries to see who's registered with CSA, and very quickly but comprehensively take a look at how well they're doing from a security standpoint when it comes to their role in the cloud. So again, all of those capabilities that we talked in the previous slides, all those characteristics that we want to look for in the cloud, we can find those covered using these CSA tools. And finally, one last golden rule on this topic of what to look for in a cloud provider is that no organization can outsource accountability ever. That's in the guidance, and it's definitely hammered in this module, because no matter what characteristics you look for in a provider, no matter where they draw the line in the shared responsibility model, we as the users can't outsource accountability, right? So we do everything that we can to analyze and manage the risk, but we are still accountable for the data that we put in the cloud. Okay, so the next part of this module was incident response. And for anybody who's done incident response, at their organization, there's probably a couple key differences, but you'll find that it's more or less the same. It's just in a slightly different environment. So on the right are the major steps of incident response, and you'll probably recognize them, right? The first one being preparation, second one being detection and analysis. Third stage would be containment, eradication, and recovery. And once you've resolved the incident, then you do a post-mortem to make sure you capture all the lessons learned.
So one of the things that definitely, maybe Michael, if you want to chime in on the incident response in the cloud, more or less it is the same, but you do need to know where the shared responsibility, and that's where the biggest part lies. People don't realize a lot of times in cloud, the things are not as simple or not as similar that we are used to being on-premise data centers or the data centers that you control from end to end. So in cloud incident response, yes, the steps are almost similar, but underneath the procedures might be different. The process, something you might have to go through your cloud provider, might be something that you have to work with a third party. So keep that in mind when you're going through it, when you're considering incident response in the cloud, keep those things in mind and always have shared responsibility in your mind.
Yep, thanks, Victor. Okay, so the first stage in incident response, preparation. Like Victor was saying, you know, this is there are key differences in the way that responsibility is split between yourself and the cloud provider. So it's important, especially more than ever, that you understand where your data is and then how it moves. And you also really want to understand the SLAs and the contracts that you sign, because you know these are the key ingredients that are going to determine what amount of service and support you're going to get from your cloud provider. So you want to kind of look at your communication and your enforcement tool. You want to understand how you can communicate with the provider. How can you reach them? What channels you can reach them at? But also vice versa. How can they reach you? Do they email just some inbox that doesn't get monitored, or do they actually have somebody that they can reach if there is an emergency? Also keep in mind that you know the service level that you get, it could be dependent on the service option that you're paying for. I know there are, at least in the AWS, there are different levels of support that you can pay for. You know, if you're enterprise and paying for the biggest package, the most expensive package, you can probably get response almost immediately. But if you're not, you might be paying for something where you get response, you know, after maybe a couple hours, maybe even after a couple days. You want to build a cloud jump kit. So a cloud jump kit is having an incident response set of tools, which in this case, it's sort of specific to conducting incident response and forensics in a cloud environment. And you want to have that one ready in the event of an incident. You also want to architect for faster detection, investigation, and remediation. So we've talked a lot about how you want to be able to do a lot of monitoring and detection in your cloud environment, and how that's sort of different. There are some key differences between that and doing it on-prem. Understand what those differences are, what you need to do in order to get enabled sort of that detection, the investigation, and the remediation of your environment when an incident occurs. Test your plan. This is always the case. When you have an incident response plan, make sure you test it. The guidance says to test it at least annually, and definitely whenever there are any large architectural changes. And then the last point to kind of circle back to what we said at the beginning is know who to call, know who to communicate with at your cloud provider. All right, detection and analysis. So detection depends on data availability. You know, you want to know your data sources. So the provider can give you data if you ask for it. You know, certainly the case if you are in a platform as a service, maybe as a software as a service model, you can ask the provider because they will probably have data on their own that they might be able to give you if you can get a hold of them. But you also might be collecting data that you yourself, right? But remember that shared responsibility will determine what you can collect and what the provider is collecting. Analysis impacted by lack of transparency to providers, infrastructure. This is a tough one. Victor, maybe you can explain it, where, you don't always see what's behind the scenes. You don't control the hardware, and you might get the most transparency in an infrastructure as a service model, but even then, there are certain things behind the scenes that you don't get to see that you may have to ask the provider to give to you in the event of an incident. And if it's, you need to go into like a court because of something like that.
Michael will give a quick example once you've gone through all the 4 phases.
And I can actually give one on exactly that piece right there, if you don't mind.
Yep, go right ahead.
Sure. And so this has changed in the last 6-ish, 9-ish months. But I gave a presentation last summer at the Rocky Mountain Information Security Conference on AWS security. And one of the things that I used to have in my slides was I tried for a long time trying to figure out how I could do full packet capture in AWS, and finally realized I couldn't do it the way I wanted it to. And so I'm trying to dig up the PDF, and I'll share it in the chat for everyone. But long story short is that it wasn't built in until the end of last year that you could do full packet capture. So if you wanted to actually see more than just like SFlow, NetFlow type of transactional logs, you could try and put Wireshark on an endpoint, but there was no network-based way to tap into the network and see the actual full packets traversing. And what was also interesting in the research is that they actually encapsulate their own traffic. So they're using their own encapsulation rather than, if anyone remembers the OSI model and how things are encapsulated, they actually use their own protocol to encapsulate data within its own VPC. And so stuff like that, where I wanted to be able to come out with an instant response in the cloud and just put in what I would normally do in an environment is I drop in a box with something like Security Onion or Bro or Sniff Traffic, and just tap it in by literally plugging into their network. That was no longer an option. And even reaching out to AWS, they said, no, we're not going to give you that option either. So I think that's just one real world example of they've changed that, but there's plenty of times I run into that where you just can't get the same kind of stuff you could when it was on-prem.
Thank you, Michael. Thank you, Victor. That's great. That's a great example. So sort of just kind of wrapping this part up, the data source, we talked about data sources, what should be logged in and what you're actually logging. Your logs, are they consistent? Are they complete? Are they missing information, meta information that you would otherwise expect if you were doing this logging on an on-prem network? And then we also talked about how your forensics, actually Michael was just talking about how your forensics are likely limited. Sorry, this is limited to your virtual instance. Forensics are likely limited to your virtual instance, and snapshots are useful. So if there's an incident, you definitely want to get your snapshots of your instances right away. So you capture that because you need to capture the state of everything. Sorry, I thought that this was talking about what Michael was saying about the limited packet capture. But this is sort of touching on the same theme, which is you sort of have limited visibility and limited control over a lot of it. Okay, containment eradication.
Sorry, this is Anil. I think one thing that's actually important when you're working with a vendor that's providing infrastructure as a service, I guess it depends on the kind of relationship you have, but maybe providing, if you're going through a proof of concept as you're evaluating the solution, maybe working with them and making sure that it does meet your needs, and maybe there's things that they're releasing as part of their product pipeline to provide that additional visibility. So also something I think is also important.
Thanks, Anil. Yep, that's a good point. Okay, so containment, eradication, recovery. The cloud provider's primary responsibility is to the entire customer base. So the point here is that you're not the only tenant on the network, right? It's multi-tenancy, especially in the event of if you're in a public cloud environment. So the containment might mean that they're containing you, and your services might get stopped, it might get halted, it might get affected by the cloud provider if they notice that there's something wrong, if you've had an incident. So it's important, sort of really going back to the preparation stage, that you understand how you contact the cloud provider for support, because their visibility is different than your visibility, but their priorities are also different than your priorities. Moving on, you're responsible for your own containment, eradication, and recovery. So you want to start with the management plane, the metastructure, because if that portion of your environment is compromised by an attacker, they have access to everything. That is the most critical. The management plane is the most critical component of your ability to control your environment. So you definitely want to start there. And then finally, the software-defined infrastructure allows you to rebuild in a new area without having to immediately eradicate the active attack. This means that because you can define infrastructure via software, since it's abstracted from the actual hardware, you're able to immediately work out the networking so that you can isolate maybe the instance, the breached instance in a very, very quickly. And in doing that, be able to contain and eradicate the problem faster, possibly, than you might in your on-prem network. And then the postmortem, the lessons learned at the end. This part is the module says it's mostly equivalent to how you handle for traditional infrastructure, which is really about how do you go back and communicate with your team and understand how you did and where you can learn from an incident. But this part kind of goes back and harps on the data sources that we talked about during detection analysis, how you responded to anything that might have happened in your metastructure, your management plane. And then finally, the communications with your cloud provider. Was that part smooth? Did you have a way to contact them, or did they have a way to contact you in a way that allowed you to respond as quickly as possible to your incident? Okay, so security as a service, right? We've talked about infrastructure as a service, platform as a service, software as a service. Security services with cloud-based management, it's sort of very similar in the sense that it's security services that are cloud-based and that meet the essential characteristics that we've discussed about what a cloud service is, right? So the NIST essential characteristics, if you remember from the beginning, has 5 essential characteristics. Those are resource pooling, broad network access, rapid elasticity, measured service, and on-demand self-service. If you're able to have security that meets all of that, a security service that meets all of that, that's security as a service. And the benefits of doing that are, well, we talked about cloud computing, and meets those characteristics. But you get staffing and expertise, and you get intelligence sharing, because this security provider is doing it in the cloud, and they have a lot of customers. They're able to aggregate their intelligence, right? So if something is affected on one customer, now they understand what possible signatures that they're looking for, or maybe what vulnerabilities that have been exploited, and they can look for it in your cloud environment as well. There's deployment flexibility by virtue of being cloud-based. The installation of clients is something where they can, I kind of forget exactly what this part means, but I think installation of clients means that security is sort of kept to them. Yeah, thanks, Victor.
Yeah, so any cloud provider or any service provider, they want to make sure that the clients or the consumers' networks and databases or data, it's not accessible by each other. I mean, imagine if you have Coca-Cola and Pepsi sharing the AWS environment and they can reach out to each other. That wouldn't be good, right? So that's why the installation of clients is something that security as a service would offer, so that the clients cannot reach out to each other to keep it insulated. Josh?
All right. and then scaling and cost. And that's sort of a natural benefit that we get for operating within the cloud. So your security as a service provider is going to have those benefits and be able to pass them along to you. Okay, so there are, just like every other cloud service, there are also challenges that come with this. Lack of visibility is something that we talked about earlier. Michael gave a great example of it. But there are also regulation differences. You know, your security is now operated by somebody who might not be based in the same location that you are, that might not have the same regulations that you have. So it's important that you understand what regulations that they have to meet, what you have to meet, and what the gaps are and how you can fill them in. Handling of regulated data. This sort of touches on the same thing above, right? So now your data is going to be somewhere possibly in a different location in your country or in the globe, and that's going to have different regulations as well. So the different regulations apply also to your data. Data leakage, as I understand it, being that, hey, your security provider, your security as a service provider now has access to your data because they have to protect it. If they get compromised, then your data gets compromised as well. And there have been cases over the last few years of managed security service providers that do this security as a service who've been compromised and their clients' data have been compromised. So you got to do that good research and due diligence to make sure that, you know, they're trustworthy with your information. Changing providers. This is sort of a challenge in really in anything. Every time you're going to change to a new provider for security, it's challenging, right? You just have to evaluate who you can trust to be sort of the gatekeepers to the security, to the keys to your kingdom. And it's particularly tough because now you're in a cloud environment. There's sort of so much more coverage that they're providing for you, but you're still accountable for it. And then migrating to security as a service to that environment and outsourcing your security. If you're comfortable with doing that, it really involves a lot of sort of analysis, a lot of due diligence, but also a lot of management and discussions with your team and your organization. Okay, so security as a service categories. What the categories that I feel like we've talked about a lot of these, so I'm just going to quickly run through them. Identity and access management. We've talked about identity and access management. How do you manage accounts, provision, who gets authorization, how do you authenticate people, you know, how do you make sure that they're authorized to the assets, the objects that they should be authorized to access. We've talked about cloud access security brokers when we've also talked about data loss prevention. How do you make sure you have somebody who can help you securely migrate your information to and from the cloud? We've talked about gateways, access gateways. And we've also, I don't know, we've talked so much about email security, but I think most of us understand, hey, email security as a service, you know, spam filtering, malware filtering in our email accounts is sort of something that we've all definitely have received if we're using emails in the cloud, but are all pretty just well aware of. Security assessments and vulnerability scanning. Your common vulnerability scanning providers, like Tenable, they offer services and applications that can do assessments and vulnerability scanning on a host device, but they also offer those very same products in the cloud as security as a service. Web application firewalls to protect your web applications. I believe that websites, I believe those are DNS. Those use DNS to kind of filter out traffic.
Yeah, web application firewalls allow you to monitor and detect for application layer attacks. It's not, I mean, you have a network firewall, but you can also have application layer attacks. And so the idea is to protect your app or website from being attacked on layer 7.
Okay. Encryption, we've talked about how there are there are proxy encryption, so you can send a third party, use a third party to encrypt your data as before it goes into the cloud. SIM, right? If SIM, what is security information and event management tools like Splunk to help you consolidate everything and make sure you have a high level overview but a thorough analysis of all the events, all the logs that are going on within your cloud environment. And then even business continuity and disaster response is offered as a security as a service product. So here are some recommendations really pulled straight from the module. Before you engage a security as a service provider, be sure to understand any security specific requirements for data handling, investigative and compliance support, right? So since there's that responsibility that is being given to them, that's now with them, you have to understand what it is, what the requirements are for handling your data and investigating any sort of incidents related to your security. You want to pay attention to the handling of regulated data like PII, and remember that regulations can differ for the security provider and for yourself. So understand what those differences, those gaps are. You also want to understand what data retention needs, what your data retention needs are, if the provider can match it. Remember, so your data retention needs might be different. Maybe you're in a very specific industry that has where the retention of your data is regulated or governed very differently. Make sure that you understand those, and then ensure that your security as a service provider is compatible with your current and your future plans. I know we talked about how there's a challenge of migrating to different security as a service providers. So you kind of have to look at the big picture of whether or not they're able to accommodate what you have and right now, but also what you're going to need in the future. Okay, so we're almost done. We just want to touch real quick on related technologies in the cloud. These didn't fit into other modules, so they kind of stuck it in right at the end. I think everybody kind of knows, I definitely know these in general. So if anybody wants to give examples of it, definitely feel free to jump in. You might be working in this field and your examples will definitely help illustrate what we're talking about. But we're just going to quickly run through big data, IoT, mobile, and serverless technologies. Okay, so big data is, I think it's pretty self-explanatory in terms of the name, big data. And you'll see on the left here of this illustration what the guidance calls the 3 V's, right? High volume, high velocity, high variety. So high volume is, we're talking about lots of data, just the sheer quantity of it. We're also talking about high velocity. When we talk about elasticity, the size of that data, the amount of it, it can change rapidly. It can grow and decrease very, very rapidly. And then high variety, all the data types could be very, very different. But all together with those 3 V's, you have big data. The challenge is that now you're doing it all in the cloud. So now that you're in the cloud, you have to know that your data is all distributed, across who knows where the infrastructure is that it's residing on, as well as the storage being distributed, and even the processing of all of that data. Okay, IoT. I think I was just talking, I'm sorry, I was talking with somebody earlier about IoT in their home, right? So all these smart devices that you might have at home, or maybe if your car, right? Everything is now being hooked up to the internet. It's being able to be controlled through APIs. It's also collecting data. And all of that presents its security challenges because, how do you make sure that they're all secure by default? How do you know that the credentials are changed out? The keys aren't sort of copied over and used over and over, and it's just simply shared and other people have it. How do you make sure that your devices are patched and updated? How do you make sure that the communications are encrypted over the through whichever gateways you're using to communicate with your IoT devices? Mobile and cloud. This is all pretty straightforward. We use mobile devices, and they're all very powerful individually today. but a lot of these apps connect to the cloud for any sort of backend processing. And that's sort of really what their key utility is, right? Mobile devices help keep you connected to the cloud. But because you're always connected to the cloud, because these are always using and transferring information up to it and from it, it's important that these always have the security capabilities that we discussed earlier in this lesson. And then finally, serverless. We've touched a little bit about serverless, how serverless is sort of it includes functions as a service and then platform as a service where you can run code in a quote unquote serverless environment where you don't really have to understand what the underlying infrastructure is to run that code, but it can execute functions. And when you use this well, if you use it properly, you're able to address a lot of components, automate a lot of security tasks that you would otherwise wouldn't be able to do if you didn't set up a serverless set of functions. And that just brings us to the last point, CCSK exam prep. And I know Victor wanted to be able to talk about this.
All right. Thank you, Josh. That was good. So now that we have gone through all the modules, I'm sure you all have trained yourself and ready for CCSK exam. So I'll quickly cover a couple of tips that helped me to pass the exam. First is it's open book. Come on, you can't beat that option. Google is your friend. You can have all the CCM Excel sheets readily available for you. And if you have two screens, make sure you're using one screen for the exam. The other one is to have like that open book, quote unquote, Google. The exam is 90 minutes, so keep an eye on the clock. Don't fall in something that you're looking at it or you're researching. All of a sudden now you're reading an article that sounds or looks interesting. Don't fall for that. And the last tip is that go through the training, go through the official training twice, at least. That's what it helped me. I've gone through once and I did the practice test. It's online, actually. If you just Google CCSK practice test, there's a flashcards, 15 questions. It helped me to kind of gauge, I still need to train myself again. I've gone through the material one more time, and that made me comfortable that I could sit for the exam. I passed it for the first time. However, if you don't, it does give you 2 attempts. So even if you don't pass it for the first time, you can take a second attempt without to pay for it. So those are my tips. Once again, I'm sure you all will pass it. If I can pass it, you all can. That's my. All of the previous week's modules have been published already. So you have the slide decks, you have the recordings already. So please use these short links, or please follow us on LinkedIn or Twitter or YouTube. You'll find all of those recordings and slides.